Welcome to Real News. It is the 18th day of the conflict between Israeli Defense Forces, the State of Israel, and Hamas inside of the Gaza Strip. In fact, now, as we will tell you, the conflict has extended beyond the Gaza Strip. There are over 800 Palestinian deaths at this point, over 30 Israeli deaths, and there are exchanges of fire ongoing. This is something that we're going to dive into with you. But first, I want to bring in Dovid Efune. He's the editor of Algemeiner newspaper. Dovid, thank you for your time.
Pleasure.
Dovid, first, one thing that's notable is the expansion of this into the West Bank in some capacity. It's not a military expansion, but we can show you footage of some very serious protests from Thursday with more than 10,000 people reportedly participating, 250 injured, and 5 are said to be dead at this point from these protests. Those protests continue in the West Bank on to today. Protesters are throwing rocks and Molotov cocktails at soldiers. We show you a photo of the West Bank city of Ramallah there. Dovid, is this a particularly ominous expansion of this, or was this to be expected that the West Bank, the other territory, not Gaza, would somehow get pulled into this?
Well, truth is we have yet to see exactly how far this is going to go, but it's clear, obviously, that both Hamas and Fatah, the Palestinian Authority, are not happy with what's happening in Gaza, and they're looking to kind of draw some of the Israeli attention away from Gaza, and they both have very, very serious strongholds in the West Bank. So we've seen Hamas calling for a third intifada, which would be a very, very significant development, and incidentally, Fatah of the Palestinian authorities, Mahmoud Abbas, also calling on his Facebook page. They put a post today which implies that they're calling for a third intifada. Fridays are generally hot, so it's hard to judge based on what's happening on a Friday because that's when the prayers take place. So I think we have to wait and see over the weekend if things remain hot there in the West Bank.
These also mirror protests we've seen not just in the Middle East, but also in Europe, right? We've seen these happen in Paris and other countries in the West as well. So these Palestinian protests certainly aren't limited to Israel.
And this is tying directly into the PR part of this whole aspect, and also now because of a strike on a UN school yesterday, which killed 16, and there were scores of wounded as well. There's now outrage about this. The school was taking in people who were fleeing strikes on homes. It was under UN protection. And then a UN spokesman tweeted out that over the course of the day, UNRWA tried to coordinate with the Israeli army a window for civilians to leave, and it was never granted. Now, since that has been he hasn't retracted it, but there's back and forth as to whether that's true. Dovid, this strike on a school that's supposed to be under UN protection with people that are cowering in fear, understandably, from the strikes that are happening, that are terrified of what's going on around them, this seems to have sparked a new level of international condemnation. Is it clear who did this? And also, is this going to change the way the Israelis are operating in Gaza?
This is really a watershed moment, which brings up a fundamental issue which is never discussed in the mainstream media, and that is this. You have hundreds and thousands of rockets that are being shot out of Gaza. In our estimations, at least 25% of those rockets do not make it into Israel and fall short into Gaza. You have the IDF saying the other day that they had at least 100. They showed a map of rockets that fell inside of Gaza. And remember, in Gaza, there are no air raid sirens. All of the bunkers are used absolutely by the Hamas terrorists, where they don't allow the citizens to go inside. There's no warning, and they cause tremendous damage. On the ground, though, you have the Hamas guys on the ground and the UN who don't challenge it and back it up, and they come in and blame everything on Israel, all the damage.
Well, this goes back to something I said earlier in the week, and I was making the point about also something that is not widely reported in the media is Hamas's use of civilians as human shields. And these UN schools, there have been questions about whether these folks are helping Hamas, whether they're in cahoots with them. You know, they found rockets in these schools in these UN-sponsored schools, and they turned them over to the police, and the police are run by Hamas. So the fact that Israel isn't just indiscriminately launching rockets into schools to kill kids, Hamas continues to use these as civilians, as human shields, but nobody talks about that aspect of it, and it's grossly unfair. If anything, they engage in a disinformation campaign where they say, well, that's never been proven, Hamas isn't doing that, yet Hamas brags in their own social media sites and things about how they do this.
I'll tell you something further. You know, the IDF released a statement today saying that one of their soldiers was killed by fire that came directly from the UN school.
You know, I think you're pointing out something fascinating. We have heard, by the way, to some extent, the use of human shields. I have not heard until you just mentioned it, and it certainly stands to reason. These rockets fired off by Hamas are completely without guiding systems. They are fired off haphazardly. What's to keep one from going up and coming right back down in Gaza, or traveling a short distance, landing in other parts of Gaza? We don't know what happened at this UN school, but that's a possibility as well.
Beit Yanoun, which is where this happened, is in sort of the northeastern corner of Gaza. Right. So if you were firing, if you look at the trajectory, if you were trying to fire into Israel, it would come down in or around possibly that area.
Well, that's what the IDF told us. We spoke to them right afterwards, and they said, we know that rockets landed short in this area.
Well, that's absolutely true. And they also are firing from areas right around the school, which makes it very difficult for Israel to target certain areas without taking any risk. One of the things that I had heard, and I'm going to ask you because you're more familiar with it, is why would Israel want to back down now? Why would Israel even want peace now? Israel is at a point where Israel has had to back off every single time for a peace negotiation that goes nowhere, that ends up flat on its face. So what if Israel just goes full force and says, you know what? We're not backing down now. We're going to take off the head of the snake. And this is something that I've been hearing, and I'm wondering if it's a similar thing that you're hearing as well.
Well, I think you're asking two separate questions. The question of peace, who doesn't want peace? I mean, it's clear that the Israelis pray for peace and they want peace. The big question is how you're going to reach it. In terms of what's going to happen in Gaza and how far Israel can go, there's no doubt that the Israeli public is not willing to live with this anymore. It's become kind of a biennial event where their lives are in disarray. And, you know, you're dealing with a responsible democratic country with an elected government, and they have to do what they can to protect their citizens. They do not have any choice in this matter. Having said that, there's a lot of international pressure led by Secretary of State Kerry for Israel to pull back.
Already we know there's been a rejection of the ceasefire earlier today. The Kerry-brokered ceasefire. Secretary of State is over there trying to do something. I think that's an accurate description so far of what he's been able to accomplish. But of course the UN is also playing a role in all this. We discussed a minute ago how there have been some UN schools that are used as places to essentially keep missiles or rockets to be fired off. The UN's weighing in on this, Dovid, and we have Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, who has angry words for both sides. Listen.
You must stop fighting and enter into a dialogue. Whatever grievances you may have, this is wrong. Why are you continuing to kill people? There are many other ways to resolve this issue without killing each other. I'm angry about what this is doing, what they are doing. They should be responsible for their own people. They should be responsible for history. They should be responsible for international human rights law.
Now, Dovid, he's obviously pointing blame at, not even necessarily blame, he's just saying that we need to stop the fighting in some capacity. He's calling it out on both sides.
Easy for him to say.
He's
really?
saying whatever he's saying. But what's interesting is that the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights said there seems to be a strong possibility that international humanitarian law has been violated in a way that could amount to war crimes. Now people are talking about war crimes, and some of them, particularly from the UN, are going to be pointing at Israel. On top of that, we have a senior Israeli official saying that rockets were passed on to government authorities in Gaza, which means Hamas. In other words, a UN agency handed to Hamas rockets that could be shot at Israel. Is the UN playing a constructive role in this? Are they even managing to do the most simple things of protect people and not take sides?
The UN is a very unfortunate disaster, complete disaster. You have a situation there where the worst human rights violators in the world are running the show at the Human Rights Council. So you basically have murderers who are judging themselves, which is, it's ridiculous, it's preposterous. But the biggest problem is that the UN is really protecting the biggest human rights offenders. It's clear that Hamas is using human shields. It's clear that Hamas, which is a terrorist organization, a theocratic government, is holding its population hostage. Those are the violations that the UN has to be focused on, and they're letting Hamas off scot-free completely.
Wasn't Iran the head of the Human Rights Council at one point, or one of those countries, or Libya or something, like some ridiculous amount?
Libya was for a while.
Like head of the Human Rights Council. That should tell you all you need to know about the effectiveness of the UN.
I heard UN officials talking from Gaza to the BBC early this morning, and just blatantly putting the blame directly on Israel. And it was just surprising that they would be so direct. I know that one of the officials tried to placate that and say, well, we're looking into this, we have an investigation. But I think that you bring up a very good point that the UN is definitely playing some kind of role, and it's not on Israel.
David, there's so much going on. I just wanted to cover this with you before we run out of time, and that is the tunnels. The tunnels that we now know were set up not just to shelter weapons and senior Hamas operatives, not even just to be used for kidnapping purposes, to kidnap Israeli civilians, but we can show you some of the tunnels here. You see them in the background. These are very serious. These were used, of course, with material that that was supposed to be used to build homes in Gaza. They're building tunnels for warfare. But David, tell me about the plot that was discussed this morning that could have resulted in a mass casualty event inside of Israel based upon these war tunnels.
Well, it's just really we're starting to see filter through, because there have been quite a number of Hamas operatives which were captured alive, and they're being interrogated now by Israeli security services, and bits of information are starting to leak through. And what we see is that there was a very, very extensive attack that could have been planned, where hundreds or even thousands of Hamas fighters could have come over and seized and attacked small Israeli towns or cities or kindergartens or whatever it was, which of course, you know, elevates the need for Israel to shut this all down immediately.
Where's the open condemnation of that? Where is the unequivocal condemnation of that, though?
How do you negotiate peace with a government that wants to wipe you off the face of the earth?
Which is why the moral equivalency that these leaders continue to put forth and apply to this issue is so frustrating. There is no moral equivalency here. Here's a perfect example.
It doesn't seem like there's an immediate end in sight. Ceasefire so far rejected. David, always good to see you. Thanks again for joining us.
Always a pleasure.
Despite increased international pressure after the downing of Malaysian Airlines Flight 17, Russian President Vladimir Putin shows no signs of altering the course of his policy in Ukraine. In fact, he's escalating it. Tonight, Will Kane takes a look at the man behind the international crisis.